welcome to AT&T ThreatTraq for September 24th, 2013. This program provides network security highlights, discussion, and countermeasures for cyber threats. I'm joined today by Jim Clausing, John Markley, John Hogoboom, and I'm Brian Rexroad. And let's talk a little bit about 0 days. And Jim, I guess not surprising, there's yet another 0 day that's been discovered. What can you tell us about it?
Yes, Microsoft released a security advisory last week about a 0 day in Internet Explorer, and they have not released a patch on it yet, but they have released a fix-it. It allows remote code execution, the vulnerability does. So it's kind of a big deal, especially since it is being seen in the wild. To date, most of the attacks that have been seen have been in Japan, but they're out there. The exploit is out there, and so I suspect that other bad guys will try to take advantage of that. The thing about a fix-it from Microsoft is that it doesn't automatically install. So if you're running Internet Explorer, especially 8 and 9, although it apparently affects all of the current versions, you need to go to Microsoft's website to download it and install it. And at the moment, the fix-it only exists for the 32-bit version of Internet Explorer. 64-bit version is still vulnerable. Now, there are some workarounds, and additional countermeasures that are discussed in the blog on the Microsoft Security Resource Center blog. So if you're using IE as your primary web browser, I urge you to install the fix-it if you can. Additional workarounds, and I expect that since Microsoft jumped on this so quick with the out-of-cycle security advisory, I suspect they'll have a patch out for it relatively soon.
Yeah, and I noticed that apparently there were some, you'd mentioned that some of the exploits were discovered as associated with attack activity in Japan or targeting organizations in Japan. And, clearly it appears that there was some, clear motive behind this activity, so it appears that they're trying to react to it the best they can.
Yeah, and there are versions of the exploit that are floating around out there, easy to get your hands on if you know where to look. I anticipate that it will be even more widespread in the not-too-distant future. So, as I said, apply the fix-it if you can, apply the other countermeasures if you can't, and be on the lookout for a patch from Microsoft, which I anticipate in the not-too-distant future.
Okay. Now, can you outline a little bit what the the workarounds might be and what that might mean to users?
Well, one of the workarounds is to set the Internet and Intranet security zones to high. That blocks ActiveX and active scripting from those zones, and that's one of the primary avenues that they were using to exploit this. The downside of that is, it affects usability. Another of the fixes that they're suggesting is to set Internet Explorer to require to prompt the user before allowing active scripting. And this can get really annoying if you've got a site that's got a lot of it, and it can affect usability. But it's better than nothing.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. That's good information to have. At least there is a workaround, even if it does have some impact on usability. At least we're not sitting in the dark, trying to figure out if we'd be affected by it or not. And I guess with that, there's obviously been a lot of discussion or press around and in fact, I think a lot of downloads associated with iOS 7. and lo and behold, there's already a little bit of a patch associated with it. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, there was a lot of discussion on some of the mailing lists that I'm on last week, the day that iOS 7 was released, about the amount of network traffic that it generated. But there was also, within about a day or so thereafter, reports of a bug with the fingerprint scanner in the iPhone with iOS 7. And to Apple's credit, they got a patch out there within another day or two. So it's only been a week since iOS 7 was released, and they've already released 7.0.1.
Okay, so I guess it's obviously good to hear that they're on top of the patching process and providing some new information. I guess, there's been a lot of discussion about, the merits of the fingerprint scanner. That's a nice new piece of technology that's being introduced to the iPhone 5S. And I guess, I don't know, John, do you have any comments about this?
Yeah, there's actually been a couple articles recently, that really kind of highlight how the patents that Apple's submitted, as well as, the observations on how it actually works. How does the fingerprint scanner, physically operate? And, and it kind of goes back to that concept of, we used to always hear about people cutting off somebody's finger and running across the fingerprint scanner. That's been kind of the bogey that's ran through the security world for some time. And so there was a lot of discussion about how does this all work, and are we really concerned about that type of thing? And so if you look at the technology for the fingerprint reader on the iPhone 5S and the 5C, and a lot of other common, technological devices that are out there, there's some things that you think about. First off, it's got to have physical access. So you cut somebody's finger off, but you also got to have the phone. And I don't want to mean to be graphic all the time, but it's you gotta have the device in your hand. You got to have that physical access to it. A finger, if it's cut off, is not alive. The phones work off of capacitive and radio frequency RF, and so something that's not living, it takes a little bit of effort to mimic that type of resistance and response out of a non-living tissue. And not to say it can't be done, it's just a little bit more complex. Fingerprints, if you think about your fingerprints, you grip a glass or whatever, you're using certain parts of your fingerprint. So when you scan it, it's going to be that portion of your finger that you scan. So again, it's like, how do you know that scanner, not living tissue, how do you know that was used, and was swiped across that screen in this format, is it, or just across the corner of it, or just a pinky, or which finger? The storage of that is usually kept local. There's no reason to go external. So there's a lot of those things that get into play on how technology functions and features in those devices to read your fingerprint. I mean, it's not where it's actually looking at a logistical, this dot goes to this line and this swirl and whatever. It's actually hashing that number, comparing it to a hash that's stored on the device itself to unlock it. If you think about all those tweaks and twists and ways that, you think of how somebody could maybe mimic that living tissue, most of these devices have 4-digit pins. How much easier would it be just to guess 4 digits? So it's a lot of effort. The technology works, and it's just something that you have to think about from a usability perspective. But it is certainly it works very well.
Yeah, so another that I heard today was most people use the thumb of whichever hand is holding the phone. That's the easiest one to use, and how difficult it is to actually get a good thumbprint off of, if you're trying to take the fingerprints off the phone itself. You're either moving it, so you're smudging it, or you're holding it on the side where you're only going to get a little sliver of it. You're not going to get the whole thing. So, yeah, it isn't necessarily as easy to get the fingerprint off of there.
And the article points out that, usually when you're scanning it, like right the tip, right? The very tip. That's not what you grip something with. You're not gripping something with the tip. You're gripping something with the flat. So.
Right. Yeah, there are a lot of little subtleties in here. I think personally, I've been a little bit of a skeptic of biometrics. I think this is a case where there certainly is merit and value added by this, but I'm a little bit, I guess I'm kind of expecting that there are going to be some cracks that come associated with this. That is I realize there's a bounty out there to try to, find a way to get around it. But I think your points are very valid, that, this is certainly an improvement to just having a passcode. It certainly provides additional options. And in some cases, I think people don't use passcodes because they're just simply too much of an annoyance, whereas, being able to place your finger on it and get some reasonable validation that you're the proper user is going to be able to control it. And, personally, just sort of as a side note, it was my impression that perhaps as valuable as a part of this, as a deterrent of losing devices, is the fact that they're doing some things to make it more difficult for someone to activate a device once it's been registered to a particular user. And so, accessing the device is one aspect of it, but this, they may even wipe the device, but even if they wipe the device, it still won't be able to be activated since it's registered to a specific user or iCloud account. So I think the combination of those two things will likely provide or at least I hope, will provide a significant deterrent to theft of the devices. And, in some cases, is blatantly just stealing it right out of the hands of people as they're using it.
Yeah, and remember, too, that the 5C isn't really a fingerprint reader. I think I may have misspoken. So, it's just a 5S.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think Jim had made a comment once, and I kind of agree with this, is that, I can change a PIN code, but I can't change my finger. So that's the one thing I don't like about biometrics. And if I was going to adopt a biometric solution like this, I'd want to be able to have a two-factor where it uses my fingerprint as well as a PIN code. But maybe I'm overly paranoid, so I don't know.
Oh, certainly you can change your fingers.
Turn it off.
Okay, well, I guess perhaps we should get back onto more realistic topics. Okay, so thanks for those comments there, John. I think those are actually good points. And again, I think it's very positive to see that Apple's been pretty quick with the turnaround and fixing that that was discovered. John, last week we had a little discussion about the features of iOS 7. We also, were just talking about it a little bit now as well. And you also had some discussion about sources of vulnerability information. And I guess, do you have an update that can kind of mash the two of those together?
Yeah, certainly. Thank you, Brian. The last week, like you said, is I talked about some of the common sources of public information as well as some ones you may pay for. The common ones, I gave like 8 or 9 or different sources that were pretty good that were public, one of which was the National Vulnerability Database. It's hosted by the government out of NIST, which is a national organization. And so when the iOS 7 release was announced, and it's just a good example, on September 18th, the National Vulnerability Database began sending out all these RSS feeds identifying all the patches that Apple had been able to incorporate into that iOS 7 so that they were able to close out the common vulnerabilities, the CVEs. They were actually able to close those out. And there's about 80 of them. So it was a lot, and they identified that. So if you had, followed up, I guess, with the recommendations I had given last week or had signed up for these announcements, you would have got a good idea of what's in the release of iOS 7 and be able to evaluate, should I load this? What's the importance of it? And this was, like I said, this is just a good example because there were so many of them. And I thought it was a good follow-up for this week's program.
All right, cool.
And for those of us who do read the release notes on these, the bulletins that Apple puts out, that Microsoft puts out, usually do a fairly good job of listing the CVEs of the vulnerabilities that they're patching. But I do subscribe to the RSS feed from from NIST to get these updates. So yeah, on patch days like that, when when the Microsoft patches come out, when the Oracle patches come out, when Apple patches come out, then my RSS feed fills up with these where you list all of the vulnerabilities that have been patched.
Mm-hmm. All right. Cool. Okay, so John, maybe we've been talking a little bit about vulnerabilities here. Obviously, we're trying to prevent being a victim of malware. And clearly, mobile malware is one of the things that we've been, paying attention to. We want to make sure that there aren't any rashes of incidents developing. But, clearly, the statistics are going up. And maybe you can elaborate a little bit on that.
Yeah, certainly. Thanks, Brian. The couple of members of my team here at AT&T, we did a survey. Koss and Don on the group, did probably the bulk of this work. And what they did is they looked at all these public, announcements of all these vendors. And if you think about it, you get an alert or a notice of an Android or a, Windows, BlackBerry, whatever, a type of malware or botnet. And it's kind of interesting to try and figure out how does that relate to my device? How does that relate to, is this more, is this less? There's a whole long argument of a family versus a variant of malware, and how do you measure that particular, instance of an infection? And different companies do this differently. So what we kind of looked at is there any way that we could take all these various studies, we got F-Secure and Symantec, NQ Mobile, Lookout, McAfee were the ones we targeted, and actually make them into a single view. So trying to eliminate some of the different ways to measure it, normalize it, and what we were able to identify is that, we could get all these reports for a common period of time, which in this case was 2012, and try and figure out, and I know it's now September 2013, so it seems kind of scary, but try and figure out, what are we actually looking at? What are we seeing? And so when you look at all these statistics and these different ways of measuring it, it actually is kind of interesting. It comes into a very common view of the mobile malware environment. And if you graph the raw numbers and, and of course statisticians can make things twist however they want to. But if you start graphing that into a chart, stick some logarithmic scales on it, you can actually see that every one of these charts, you can actually begin to perceive that, that the rate of malware infections in the mobile world is growing. Mm-hmm. No question that it's growing. I think that there is some argument that's out there. Is it this sharp spike, that goes up? Is it a steady growth that never fluctuates? There's a lot of ways you can argue that and turn that. But if you look at, certainly, we're not seeing a flat line on any of these measurements. We're seeing a steady growth. We're seeing an increase. We're seeing a lot of things that, if you actually look at the numbers, it's where, if the users were a little bit better educated, they don't answer yes to some of the prompts, or where they actually go forward and look at the settings. I think that some of these instances would decline a little bit sharper, but it is very common view between all these studies that show that that malware is here, it's present, and it's going to keep getting worse.
Right. There's I guess a couple of things to point out here. One is that you did mention that this is on a logarithmic scale, which tends to flatten out the curve significantly. So it makes it a little harder to see the growth there. So any growth on a logarithmic curve obviously is going to be significantly exaggerated if this were actually on a linear graph. But also I think it's kind of interesting to note that the numbers that are cited here in terms of, sort of it looks like a cumulative. Is this cumulative across?
No, they're new. Other than they're new.
So it is clearly sort of demonstrating the growth activity, but at the same time, I think what is being cited here in terms of per month activity is probably somewhat typical of per day activity and things that are not classified specifically as mobile malware. So there's certainly a lot of other things going on that factor in this as well. So clearly, as you said, it's growing probably more significantly than this graph really lays out, because it is on a logarithmic scale, or perception-wise. But at the same time, it's still significantly below what we see in the the conventional exploits against laptops.
It is so it's something that you perceive that it's we're gonna continue to have this. I mean, people are getting away from the computers. They're going into the phablets and the tablets and the phones, and we're gonna see this. I think it's going to overtake the PC world at some point in the near future.
Okay, John, thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought I'd bring something to the table today that is a little different than we've typically discussed in the past. I would say it's basically on the periphery of the topic of security, but at the same time, I think it's probably worthwhile to consider this. There are sort of some security aspects of this that you might want to consider. But I happened to stumble across an article. It was actually on CNN. There's a video article there as well as the text version of it. And the topic of this is, can your cell phone bring down a plane? And it really talks a little bit about some of the things that are associated with the rules that we're required to follow, turning off our cell phone, only able to operate devices above 10,000, or any electronic device above 10,000 feet, and then it has to be an approved device. And so I thought this was actually a good article. I encourage you to read it, but to point out some of the things that I found interesting about this is, one is that they point out, yes, the risk of interference from a cell phone or electronic device is relatively low, but we also need to consider the consequences are high. That is, obviously you don't want a serious accident involving people's lives to be a consequence of devices that are being used that could have simply been turned off for a period of time. And there are, in fact, numerous cases of reported, at least suspect, interference associated with devices. And, in fact, that's kind of the underpinning behind that 10,000-foot rule, is that 10,000 feet buys the pilots time to be able to diagnose an interference problem, hopefully get it straightened out, whereas if you're in the middle of an approach close to the runway, concentrating on other aspects that need to be considered, you obviously don't want to be having to diagnose some kind of interference problem, or even trying to figure out if there is an interference problem or not. So, and one of the things I just wanted to sort of share with you along these lines is I put a rudimentary, this is actually an instrument landing system, the indicator that a pilot typically is using. It's very simplified. That is, typically, in the new cockpits, they're using a display that has a number of things that are overlaid on top of this indicator. But 2 points I wanted to make here is that in a weather situation, what we call instrument meteorological conditions, that's a situation where you can't see out the window. You can't tell if the runway is there or not. And about the only guidance that you have to tell you whether you're headed toward the runway or not is a needle that shows whether you're left or right of the runway, and a needle that shows you whether you're above or below the glide slope toward the runway, to make sure that you're at the right altitude toward the runway. And these are analog systems as opposed to, what we typically are used to nowadays. So consider, look back a little while here before digital TV. We were continually sort of dealing with snow on television screens. And as we transition to digital, a lot of that problem has gone away. It's very clear whether you have a good signal or not. And but these instrument landing systems, a lot of these systems are still dependent on analog technology, and not necessarily because it hasn't evolved, but because that's has something to do with the physics that are being used to do these guidance systems. But ultimately, what it comes down to is they are potentially susceptible to interference. In fact, even if you were to fly a little bit out of the range of the device, it can actually make these needles go a little bit crazy. So there are things that pilots need to do to make sure that they're on track, reasonably well aligned with the runway, tuned to the right frequency, and avoiding any confusion along the way. So anyway, that's one of the things associated with this. Another thing that they actually bring out is that modern planes, as opposed to some of the earlier planes, are being designed and built with portable electronics in mind. And what's significant about that is that One of the significant concerns, and sort of an overall concern here, is that some devices might cause electromagnetic interference. And I think a lot of us that have had earlier versions of cell phones, particularly ones that have used the Edge network or 2G, have experienced the case where their device was, set too close to a phone or to a radio, even a speaker that's not really even connected to anything, and heard the noise of interference coming in from those devices. So as cell phone technology has evolved, it's tended to go to higher frequencies, which are less susceptible to creating interference. They're also more power conscious than they used to be. And the point here being that planes are also being designed more so to deal with those types of things and be less susceptible to interference. Along those lines, I guess one of the things that the article points out is that the potential for interference is growing. Their rationale behind that is planes are more fly-by-wire now than they used to be. Actually, I kind of question that point because a lot of what is being done nowadays is digital as opposed to analog. And so, again, that topic of how much interference perhaps would be recognizable. In fact, technically speaking or typically speaking, if a digital signal is corrupted, the system's going to recognize that, raise it as an error, and make it clearly noticeable, as opposed to analog systems where it might not be so noticeable and may just cause interference. So I'm not so sure that the potential for interference is growing. I think it's actually going down over time. And I guess the last thing, they have, it's actually a peripheral article that's posted on the same website, but they're pointing out that cell services are being added to some planes. I think that's significant as well, in the sense that if you're using a cell device that's in close proximity to the tower, and in this case they're actually sort of putting a mini tower of perhaps a femtocell type thing into the plane itself, what that does is it tells the device to use a very low-strength signal, whereas if you're in the plane and your device is on, what it's going to do is try to pump out a signal that's going to try to reach the ground, and it's got to get through the metal to get there. So the tendency will be to have it basically trying to pump out a lot of power, wear down your battery in the course of doing that, but also increase the potential for creating interference. So as some of the newer planes, some services or some airlines are starting to come out with cell services on planes, it will encourage devices to be much lower power, less chance of interference of other systems on the plane. So anyway, that's the piece. That's my comments on it. I don't know, Jim, you've done a little flying around. Do you have any other observations?
Yeah, no, you covered it pretty well. The article was prompted by the FAA has initiated a study in the hopes of putting out new rules that would allow certain electronic devices to be used. You wouldn't have to turn them off. You wouldn't have to turn off your e-reader or whatever. And so, but before that can happen, they've got to create the rules, and then the airlines would all have to test their, do some tests of their individual, aircraft, like they currently have had to do before they turned on Wi-Fi service above 10,000 feet. They'd have to do something similar to basically to double check and make sure that it's not going to cause any interference.
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, Brian. I was just going to say, I actually was wondering whether deploying cell service to planes is almost going to become outmoded, because, in my opinion, having Wi-Fi is better. With a smartphone, I can actually use other voice-type services that you might have as an app on your phone and communicate with people, either FaceTime or Skype or other, tools like that that are available when you have Wi-Fi, and I've done that from a plane. And as we get more towards LTE, I'm not even sure that you would need real cell service in order to complete a telephone call or not. So I'm wondering if, that kind of movement is something that's really only going to be a temporary solution anyway. But
it's certainly a good possibility. The network technology certainly isn't static, and the way we go about things and and expect to be using network services in the future certainly is changing. So you're making a good point there, John. And there's certainly perhaps situations where it's still, so for example, FaceTime is kind of limited to certain types of devices, obviously. And so in that kind of scenario, if you're trying to talk with other users, and certainly the cell service would be an enhancement in that sense. But your point is well taken, that things will be changing over time, and it's really a question about what type of technology is going to be there and how it needs to be used.
Yeah, one of the things I guess I also should mention is that a number of airlines, the pilots in the cockpit have been using iPads for some time now, and I use an iPad when I fly. So they've done some testing, and they know to some extent what kind of interference these devices can cause, and they turn off all the radios, put it in airplane mode, essentially, or you have the GPS receiver on.
Right.
Otherwise, yeah. So they've been using iPads in the cockpit of some major airlines for some time now.
Right. Yeah, actually, some of these things have really the potential for interference actually is decreasing in a lot of the physical sense. As devices are working on higher clock frequencies, a clock and a device will generate basically a basic frequency. So if it's, for example, working on 2 megahertz, that's the fundamental frequency, and then there will be harmonics generated at higher frequencies above that. And so there's a potential that, for example, at 2 times or 10 times that frequency, you might have a harmonic that interferes with something else. But as the speeds of the clocks and the computers and even the frequencies used for some of the communications have gone up, the potential for interference has actually gone down because the harmonics are actually way above that. So, for example, this ILS system that I was referring to, it actually is using frequencies that are close to, it's in the very high frequency band, VHF band, which is around 208 to 217 megahertz, I believe, and then there's a segment that uses in the 300 megahertz band. So the potential for interference in that sense with the higher frequency devices is actually quite a bit lower as well. So it's these kinds of things that need to be taken into account. It's a little bit of an art actually trying to predict where electromagnetic interference might exist, and it has a lot to do with basically testing a lot of scenarios and getting very used to the little weird circumstances that can occur. Even just the shape of a fuselage of an airplane can have the tendency to amplify or actually suppress different frequency harmonics, which is something that you want to have to pay attention to. Very tricky science, and one of the things that, as this progresses along, I'm hoping that, it seems that they've got some reasonable rules in place, even if they're somewhat annoying for the moment, and should be evolving as we go along. So, a couple of the subtle things that the sort of security slant here is that if accidental interference could occur, you want to be concerned about if somebody were to deliberately do that. And obviously, that's something you don't, from a design standpoint, you want to be able to make systems that are robust against interference or some sort of a deliberate hacking attempt. Okay, with that, let's go to John Hogoboom here, and I guess there have been some increasing uses of anonymity in the criminal businesses. Am I interpreting your segment here correctly?
Yeah, that's right, Brian. And there's been 3 stories around the Tor network in particular, where they're using Tor. Well, first of all, if you're not familiar with Tor, and we've probably talked about it on the show before, but Tor is an anonymization network. It stands for the onion router, literally, Tor. Basically, here's a quick picture from their website, kind of explains how your network connectivity works. The green pads here are all encrypted, and basically what you do is you set up a service running on your machine that connects to the Tor network and lets you anonymize your network connection all the way until the last hop, basically, where you egress out and you make a connection to wherever you're trying to get to. And when that connection's made, in this example here, it looks like they're connecting to a machine named Bob. It actually looks like it's coming from this last machine inside the Tor network. So the person receiving the connection doesn't really know who you are per se. In any event, so it's a pretty robust anonymization network along the path the entire way. None of these nodes in between can actually decrypt, although there's been some studies into that as well. But we're not going to digress into some of the researchy aspects of how to break Tor. In any event, so there's been a couple of stories in the past month here about Tor and its use. So the first one is there was a massive botnet that kind of started to use Tor around the middle of August, or late August, I guess it was. It's called Evade, and it's also known as Lazy Alien Bikers in other circles. They integrated this Tor functionality somewhere around late August. August 19th, I think, is when they first saw it, but it really didn't ramp up until the later part of August. And there's some estimates that it's about 5 million bots strong, but I think that might be a little high. That's just my gut instinct. But some security researchers have said that. And it's mostly involved in, your typical things like adware, search hijacking, and data theft type things, password stealing, whatnot. So not doing anything surprising other than the fact that they're using Tor now for some of their command and control activity. And when they did that, this botnet had been around for a while, and people kind of just ignored it. It was off on the side with all the other botnets, and it blended into the background noise. But when they started to use Tor with such a large number of bots, it really got a lot of attention by security researchers. So they kind of did themselves a disservice by kind of pointing out that they're doing this and kind of showing a spotlight on themselves, so to speak. Mm-hmm. So I did a quick look, and you can't really tell too much. This is AT&T's visibility. There is, for the most part, Tor entry nodes usually use port 9001, although they can really use any port, but more often than not, they'll just use the default 9001 TCP port. And you can see right around this is probably like 819 around here. You can see it started to increase around that time frame. Prior to that, we saw maybe 250,000 flows per hour, and now it's kind of hovering around 3 times that, 750,000. Now, of course, we only see a portion of that in AT&T. In reality, it's probably many million more of flows really occurring, but this is a good representative sample of it's probably about a 3-factor increase in the amount of traffic they're seeing. And that's kind of what they're saying, too. Normally, they would see about 500,000 users on the Tor network, and when this botnet started to use it, it jumped up to about 1.5 million users. So there's about 1 million users or so that they're, are related to that botnet from what they've been able to tell. Next story is that somebody also did a study a few weeks back, Iovation, a security firm, that was able to determine that about a third of all Tor web traffic is fraudulent. So these would be people probably using Tor to browse the internet, maybe committing fraudulent types of activities, such as using fake credit cards to buy things or, other things of that nature. So this is just another story to kind of lend credence into the fact that, Tor has kind of gotten this reputation as kind of a dark corner of the internet where a lot of bad activity is happening. And while it is used for, benign reasons by a lot of people as well for anonymization purposes, because it works so well for anonymization, a lot of criminals kind of go to this, go to use Tor as a means to further obfuscate who they are. Mm-hmm. And then last story that I wanted to mention was the FBI actually did a sting operation where there was I believe it was in France perhaps, there was a large Tor operation that was involved in child pornography, legal activity of that nature. And the FBI actually admitted that they took control of a large portion of these Freedom hosting servers that were involved in basically handling this traffic, and they installed basically a piece of malware into response traffic. So when people would browse through this and egress out to these nodes, that were hosting this, although there's not all of it was child pornography related, hosting at Freedom Hosting, but there was a pocket that was. They would actually get some JavaScript back in their web page, and if the user was running Firefox 17 with the Tor browser bundle, there was a bug in there that they were exploiting to get the machine name and the MAC address, and then it was relaying that to a server in Virginia, I believe. So a lot of people have said that a lot of people have analyzed this code and how it works. It's called Magneto in this particular instance of it here, and it very much resembles something that people have talked about called the FBI's CPAV program, which is the Computer and Internet Protocol Address Verifier. So it's kind of consistent with that. In any event, I guess really the root cause or the root reason I brought this story up is just yet another instance of some criminal activity facilitated via the Tor network. Mm-hmm. So all that being said, why would you really care? I guess now that we've kind of shown a spotlight ourselves on Tor, you might be interested yourself. Do I have Tor either coming into my web server? Maybe you're a company and you sell stuff online with a website, like a large website. You might want to know if people entering your website are coming in from Tor nodes, Tor exit nodes. So the Tor people actually make this kind of easy. They provide, I mentioned some links here. So the first section here, detect or block inbound Tor traffic, that's actually pretty easy to do. You can get an IP list from them of all the Tor exit nodes that are known to be functioning in the Tor network at any one given point. And they also have a DNS lookup, so you can just do like a quick DNS lookup to determine if it's a Tor node or not, and do some blocking or some other things. Maybe you just want to log that and review that type of session later in your activity. There's also a tool called Tor Block that actually, I believe it's for several different pieces of software. I think it integrates with Apache as well as some other service offerings in order to, it basically uses these lists as a means to block people who might be coming in from the Tor network towards your web server or your website. In terms of detecting outbound Tor traffic, so maybe you've got an enterprise and you want to determine, hey, do I have any bots here that might be participating in this mEvade botnet that we were talking about, or using Tor to anonymize and you really don't want them to be because maybe you don't know what they're up to at that point because it is an encrypted connection. So there is, if you look into most IDSs have some capability and rules for detecting Tor usage at the packet level. It's pretty easy to detect if you look at the packet level. I know Snort has several different variations of signatures, so I would recommend you go check that out if that's something that you're worried about or you're interested in on your enterprise network to see if any of your users might be using Tor and whether that might be against your company usage policies, et cetera. So that might be something you want to address in some way.
All right, cool. Some good suggestions there, John. You'd mentioned the the sting operation that was being done there, and or the fraudulent activity, I think, is what kind of inspired the thought. I was reading an article recently, sort of tangential to this. It didn't actually say anything specifically about Tor, but it was related to online reviews and cases where they had actually done sort of a sting operation or associated with this. And this was a case where organizations were actually so blatant as to advertise that they needed somebody to post reviews for them, must be able to use a variety of source addresses for their postings, and that they would even be provided the review text so that it would be able to boost these businesses and organizations' ratings or actually counteract bad reviews associated with those organizations. So kind of interesting. That's one of the potential abuses of this kind of environment, but at the same time, it has some potential good uses as well. I guess the other thing I wanted to point out as well is if there is a need for anonymization, this provides IP address level anonymization. It doesn't necessarily cleanse the content of information that's exchanged of things that might reveal who the end user is.
That's right, yeah. So you would have to consider that if you're going to use it, as well as when it egresses and leaves one of the exit nodes, they totally have capability to look at whatever that connection is. So, there is a potential man-in-the-middle type of, capability that an exit node would have visibility in.
Yeah. So very good recommendations there. If you're running a website or something, particularly one that's associated with commerce, and you're seeing some Tor exit nodes accessing that site, I wouldn't necessarily suggest that you want to block the transaction, but you certainly want to perhaps scrutinize those transactions, raise it in the suspicious activity list.
Right. So, you had one last thing I just wanted to mention that I'd forgotten about along the same lines. Wikipedia is one of the big users of Tor block. They've even been instrumental in kind of getting it started because a lot of people were using Tor in order to anonymously go in and alter Wikipedia entries and falsely put information in there that might not be true. So they completely blatantly just block anybody coming in from Tor because they had such an abuse situation with people coming in that way and falsifying information in Wikipedia.
Well, and then actually a good point. That's a case where they want some accountability. It is a crowdsourcing activity that is dependent on being able to associate postings with particular individuals, and at least not necessarily by person, but by at least their identity, so that they can either gain or reduce credibility. Similarly, eBay does the same kind of thing. And one of the things I noticed is along those in terms of reviews and things, Amazon currently posts whether it's a verified purchase by a reviewer as opposed to others, so that perhaps that has some more credibility associated with this.
Right.
All good, very, very good points there. Looking at the internet activity over the last week or so, there were actually, I don't have any significant things to share with you here today, but we'll talk about a couple of them and then move on. First of all, as we've reported many times before, there is continuing DDoS reflection activity on port 161 UDP that's associated with SNMP. That seems to be actually still, I wouldn't say growing in terms of trends, but it certainly seems to be growing in terms of frequency. And I chose to show a little bit different perspective here today. This is actually a little bit of a comparison between the destination port 161 UDP activity in terms of bytes and the response activity. So in blue are the requests, and then in red are the response bytes. And you can see that there's a relatively steady set of bytes associated with the requests, but very spiky response activity. And we're measuring this, and that's why you can probably equate this to on the order of megabits per second, but that's not exactly the case here. But in any case, if you were to look at flows, number of requests versus responses, it'd actually be upside down. That is, you'd have more requests going out and not so many responses. And so that's basically indicative of the fact that this is, in fact, a lot of this spiky, the red activity here is, in fact, associated with denial of service attacks. And you can see that from time to time it goes up relatively significantly, and it's always sort of elevated, relatively speaking. So SNMP shouldn't be exposed to the Internet. That would be a good policy to exercise in any case, and be wary of any activity that you see, toward your sites, and perhaps there's an opportunity to block that.
So in order to really leverage that, wouldn't the attacker have to know the community name in order to get a response to come back out?
Yeah, I think, I'll be honest, I haven't investigated this in detail, but there are some fairly well-known community names that I suspect that they're going after the defaults and using those, just as we've seen with, default passwords that all too often are successful.
Right. I guess the reason I brought that up was if you're using public as your community name, you'd want to change that. I'm not against using SNMP on the internet, but don't use the default community names.
Absolutely. Next item here is, this isn't terribly unusual activity, but it has showed up a little bit more just recently. This is scan probes on port 5901 TCP We often refer to 5900 TCP, which is the primary port for virtual network computing. 5901 is an alternate port. In fact, I think if you have multiple devices on the same address, what it's basically going to do is, sequentially go through 5900, 5901, 5902, 5903 as valid server ports associated with this. So occasionally we see scanning activity looking for these alternate ports, in this case 5901. The large spike that showed up here was actually a single source in Korea, but we saw some additional activity over the last several days here associated with some activity from Russia, as well as a hosting provider, multiple servers, multiple IP addresses, but from a hosting provider in the U.S. So either somebody's leasing some servers associated with that activity, or perhaps they have compromised some servers and are using it for this purpose. Next one here, I haven't seen this one in a long time, but it certainly showed up on the radar again. This is actually scan probes on port 0 TCP. 0 TCP is a reserved port, and true to what we've seen in the past, these are often associated with what is called a Christmas tree attack, one where you're trying to basically fingerprint the operating system by basically eliciting some strange responses. So this is a case where called a Christmas tree attack, partly because it sets all of the flags in the TCP request, and that's what I'm showing here is basically the urge, act, push, reset, SYN, and FIN flags are all set, and we see that surge of activity that occurred. I guess it started around the 20th of September, and perhaps has stopped since then. So this is from a couple of days ago. And in terms of the top 10 most probe ports, very uninteresting. Most of these things we've talked about many times before. Port 445 at the top, port 53 UDP. Again, a lot of scanning activity. Some of this is actually a sort of peripheral to queries associated with DNS reflection attacks. So it can be a combination of actually probing, looking for open DNS resolvers, as well as actually conducting those attacks. Port 1433 TCP, that's a Microsoft SQL database, and then port 3389, that being the remote desktop protocol, and then port 22 TCP, which is often associated with password guessing attacks, as is the remote desktop protocol, password guessing attacks against potentially remotely accessible systems. And then we have the peer-to-peer activity on ports 16470, 471, 16465, and 16464 UDP associated with the zero access botnet, which last week we showed how it had ramped up significantly in the last, few weeks or so, and appears to continue to be ramping up. And then similarly, in terms of the most sources doing the probing, no surprises here either. Port 445 at the top of the list. The only other port that is directly associated with nefarious probing activity is 3389, and then we also see the zero-access peer-to-peer activity on this as well. So with that, that's our show for today. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can contact us through email at ThreatTraq@list.att.com. You can also find us on Twitter. Our handle is @ThreatTraq. ThreatTraq video is available on the AT&T Tech channel at att.com/ThreatTraq. It's also available on YouTube. You can subscribe to it there. You can also subscribe to an audio-only version on iTunes. I'd like to thank you for joining us today. Thank you, Jim, John, and as John Hogoboom and John Markley. I'm Brian Rexroad. We'll be back next week with a new episode. And until then, keep your network safe.